I'm Eleanor Wachtel, and this is Writers and Company. Today, from New York and London, Zadie Smith. The author of On Beauty and N.W. has a big new novel called Swing Time. Zadie Smith started writing her first novel, White Teeth, while she was still a student at Cambridge. She graduated with a first and a reported $500,000 advance. The book was published when she was only 24 years old. A big, vibrant story of cross-cultural, cross-generational, ethnically diverse London, White Teeth won 3 First Novel Awards. It was made into a television miniseries, translated into more than 20 languages, and sold over 1 million copies. Zadie Smith was born in North London in 1975, the oldest of 3 children, to an English father and a much younger Jamaican mother. I first met her just before her 30th birthday, when she published her 3rd novel, On Beauty, another multicultural, multi-generational story, this time set mostly in the Boston area. It's sort of a campus novel in that the main character is a professor of art history. Zadie Smith is a generous writer, moving easily between sensibilities, ages, intellect. On Beauty was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and won the Orange Prize. For someone who made it so big, so young, she was remarkably modest, interested, and thoughtful. I think I realized right then that this would be someone I'd want to talk to with every subsequent title. Smith is a brilliant essayist, and the next time we spoke, it was about changing my mind, her book about writing, her addiction to reading, and her family. Her essays regularly appear in the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, The Guardian, and elsewhere, tackling an eclectic range of subjects. She'll have another collection out in about 1.5 years. Her last novel, N.W., is currently being made into a BBC television miniseries. Now Zadie Smith has produced an ambitious new novel, Swing Time. It's set partly in that familiar neighborhood of northwest London where she grew up, but also in New York and West Africa. The title Swing Time invokes a 1936 Fred Astaire Ginger Rogers musical, as well as the shifts in time that the story takes. I spoke to Zadie Smith from the CBC's New York studio. Your new novel, Swing Time, features your own longtime passions, song and dance. Tell me first about song. What kind of music did you grow up with?
Well, it was a great mix. I've written about it a bit before, just because my parents had quite differing views in music. So my mother's music was mostly black soul, a lot of Aretha Franklin and Gladys Knight and the Pips and that kind of thing. My father's was a lot of baby boomer stuff, even though he was much older than that generation. Lots of Dylan and the Beatles. But I was attached to the music of the 30s and 40s, and I don't really know why. My father wasn't particularly but fond of those things, but I think for me it was a way of connecting with him, because I knew that was the music of his childhood.
You sang yourself from an early age. Was musical expression encouraged in the family?
Well, it was everywhere, but I guess my little version of it was not particularly impressive. Like, I have an aunt who really does sing like Aretha Franklin, and my brothers are both very accomplished musicians, and I played a lot of instruments and I sang, but I think within the context of my family, it was considered a minor talent.
Although you earned some money during your time at Cambridge by singing in a cabaret. What was that like?
Well, I always felt that I was an imitator. That's what I did. So I used to sing. Cabaret singing makes it sound very glamorous. A lot of the time I was singing in places like old people's homes, church halls, bad cafes. And I was just really doing impersonations of other singers, of Billie Holiday or Ella or whatever. And that I guess that kind of slightly stained my relationship with it. I felt like if you can't be original, then why do it? I was quite severe. And now I realize as an older person that, if you get pleasure out of something, why not do it for pleasure? But when I was young, I just decided it wasn't for me.
Do you have any favorite black female singers?
Well, Billie Holiday is my favorite. It's not particularly original opinion, but I can't. There's nobody better than her, as far as I'm concerned. There's something so idiosyncratic and delicate about that voice, and yet so soulful and she brings a contribution to a song like no other singer. Maybe Aretha Franklin is very close in a different arena. But there's nothing imitative or secondary about Billie Holiday. She's as kind of imaginative as the clarinet wherever she sings. She's part of the composition.
How would you characterize your singing? I was wondering if you're like anything in the narrator in Swing Time who feels she's good at expressing emotion. She makes sad songs very sad and happy songs joyful.
I mean, I was never much of a performer. I really was just an impersonator. So if you closed your eyes, I could sound like a few different people. But I think to be a musician, to be an artist, if you have respect for music, and I do, then that kind of karaoke is depressing, in my opinion.
But didn't I just see you in some video that's gone viral singing it?
Well, I didn't know I'd be recorded. No, I've been asked, everyone who was at that dinner was asked to do something they don't normally do, and so they asked me to do that.
Easy Living by Boss Skaggs.
Right, yeah. But I'm not going to make a habit of it.
You know?
No.
Your father was 50 when you were born. He was 30 years older than your mother. And you've said you got a lot of your slightly anachronistic tastes from him, I mean, for example, for the films and Hollywood musicals of the 30s and 40s. A lot of parents hope in vain for their kids to share their taste. What made it stick for you?
Well, as I said, I think really they weren't his taste, because he had tried to reinvent himself, in middle age and join the revolution. So his friends were young, his wife was young. He loved Dylan. He loved that whole era of music. But it was a kind of mistake on my part. Like occasionally I would say something, for instance, Casablanca would come on the TV and he'd say, "Oh, I saw that in the cinema," or we'd hear Sinatra and he said, "Oh, I heard him sing when he came to London." So those bits I was very curious about, exactly because he didn't talk about it very much. And it was so surreal to me to think of him as being part of this generation. I mean, he was born in 1925. He's the same age. If he'd lived, he would be the same age as the Queen right now. So it really felt like a distant remove. It's that part I wanted to engage with, but I think he was a bit bemused by it, really.
And in terms of your own interest in tap dancing, did it come from those musicals, or was it the other way around?
I think it must have. Those movies used to play on the newly established Channel 4 when I was a kid. I guess to fill time. It was a young channel and they didn't have a lot of money. And in the afternoons, they would play these movies kind of back to back. So I guess it came from there. But somebody said to me recently, which I think is a very interesting thing about writers, that they almost always have a secondary pleasure that they find much more pleasurable than writing. But at some point, they decide not to do it. And that writing is, in a way, a regulation of pleasure. And I thought that was a very clever observation. Because I see the writers I know, they often have a secondary interest. They were into sports, or they wanted to act, but writing is a way of not doing the thing that you like doing.
I know, it sounds so severe.
It's a kind of weird, but I think writers are control freaks, and it's a kind of way of controlling some uncontrollable thing, some pleasure that otherwise would be allowed to let rip. Yeah, it's an interesting psychological state.
And for you, it would be tap dancing?
I don't know. Maybe it's the whole world of the body for writers, no? Because when you write, it's so far from that life, from doing anything physical. It really is like sitting in a meditative state and only thinking. So I think there is a part of many writers which is this repressed physical pleasure that they channel into this other thing.
The narrator of your novel, Swing Time, reflects on the timelessness of dance. Picasso would be incomprehensible to Rembrandt, she reflects, but Nijinsky would understand Michael Jackson. Do you really think so?
I do think so. I think dance, the kind of movement of the body, at least there's admiration between dancers of very different generations and across huge borders, which I don't see happening in art. Art becomes incomprehensible so quickly. Like within a generation, writers cannot understand the people coming up under them. And I do think of that story that I think I put in the novel about Fred Astaire and Michael Jackson. That Fred Astaire understood absolutely that he was looking at a kind of genius. He wasn't in any doubt about that. Whereas I think writers of Astaire's generation would look at writers of Jackson's generation with some fear and horror even, you know? So I think there is some language of the body that is more easily expressed across time.
It's interesting you're talking about the movement of the body as secondary, but in a recent essay, What Beyonce Taught Me, you explore the actual connection between writing and dancing.
Yeah, I was thinking about the way that dance can teach you something, but all forms of art have certain kind of abstract lessons to present about minimalism or maximalism or naturalness or artificiality, or you can see that across the arts, and it's just dance is one of the more difficult ones to speak about because it's so non-verbal, so it's harder to translate and maybe harder to take seriously for a lot of people. And of course, it being in large part an art of the African diaspora, that's part of the concern, that this enormous art form gets unrecorded in a certain sense because there's no verbal equivalent for it. It's hard to speak about. So it was just writing that essay was a pleasure, trying to find a way to put into words what's beautiful about various different kinds of dance.
And it was more original also because people have written about music and prose, but not so much dance.
Right.
Which is not
Yeah.
only nonverbal, but purely visual, except for the sound of the tap dancing, if that's
Right.
part of it.
Right. But when you watch dance, a certain possibility opens in your mind. It's a possibility, a way of being. That's just, for me, the same thing as style. Style is just an expression of a way of being. And dance does that as acutely as anything else.
Can you say what you have learned from dancing?
It were different lessons depending on the dancer. I think the great lesson of dance to me is joy. And, when people watch a piece of dance that they appreciate, even if you just watch their face, I can watch my children as I show them a music video or, I don't know, Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. It's such a kind of suspended state of joy. They have this half smile on their face and their eyes are so intently looking at the thing. It's really a kind of sublime emotion. And also you want to follow and repeat what you see in your own body. You find your toes moving or your fingers moving. So it's something about joy and about the expression of a personality through form, You have to be extremely trained to dance as Fred Astaire did or as Nijinsky does. But then when the performance is on, the thing seems like a natural act. And that's a great lesson for any kind of artist, that you need this extraordinary structure of practice and work, and then the performance of it should have this fluidity, that the work is in some way hidden.
As a writer, you've said you had to make a choice between the grounded and the floating, using the example of Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire.
Right.
What's the analogy there?
Well, I tried to make the point in the essay that the analogy is prose that takes a lot from our kind of commonplace language, and prose has a choice of how close it hews to that supposedly shared, rational language, or how far it moves away from it. So I think the example I gave was Nabokov, who exists in a kind of language he creates himself, an entirely literary language. And for me, when I'm writing, I guess I'm torn between two poles. I certainly want to be understood and to speak plainly, but I also don't want to speak in cliche or dead language, or language that is in no way enlivening to me. So that's always a challenge, to find that balance.
But given the choice between Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire, wouldn't you go for Fred Astaire?
Well, if it were a choice. It would be very nice for everybody if we could all be like Fred Astaire, but in that case, I think you're dealing with natural genius, which is not even to be aspired to.
We'll talk more about dance in relation to your novel, but before that, Swing Time is your first fiction to be written in the first person, and you've said you've always felt a little contemptuous of that I narrator. Why?
I just experienced it as a limitation. I didn't think of it any other way, really. I just thought the kind of fiction I write that is so concerned with a diverse group of people, their relations to each other, the way they act in the world and towards each other, that I couldn't see how I could do that in a first person. The first person seemed to me kind of inward-facing. But it's not true. The first person is a kind of very cunning way to talk about many other people, because it doesn't pretend to be objective. It's completely subjective. Like if you think of, I don't know, Humbert Humbert in Lolita, you see a whole world in Lolita, but it's told through this very jaundiced perspective. But that's part of the pleasure, that you're seeing the world through his eyes, which after all is how everybody sees the world, through your particular sensibility. So it feels like there's something vigorous about it as compared to pretending to this perfect objectivity on the world, this voice from nowhere that just sees everything and knows everything and is always wise. I quite like the idea of telling a story from a very particular place.
Well, you've talked about the thrill and the dread of writing in the first person. Why thrill and dread? And
Well, the dread is, I mean, all the obvious reasons that the first person is so convincing to people that they really feel it's you. And I think the tiresomeness of that over a long stretch, like I think of someone like Philip Roth, who spent, 50 years defending himself against accusations of being these various avatars. I understand why readers do it because it's a completely natural instinct, and I have it too. When I'm reading, I always make this autobiographical error, even when I know the writer very well. But when you're writing, you know that fiction just doesn't work that way. And some of the things which feel most real in a novel are reliably the most artificial, the most phony, and the biggest lies, So I was wary of that, but it's also something you're playing with, I think, in the fiction, that you know that readers have this autobiographical instinct, and you can mess with it a little bit. And I think in Swing Time, one of the mistakes people make with an autobiographical idea is that a narrator will always be presenting themselves in her best light or his best light, because why wouldn't you? Because that's how everybody thinks of themselves in the world. So a narrator who isn't particularly selling themselves one way or another is a slightly destabilizing position, and I quite like doing that.
yeah, it's certainly a more complex approach to it. Do you think therapy helped you in this? Because that is the most obvious form of the I expression.
Only in the sense that I haven't done very much therapy, but just that it makes you less self-conscious just about the idea of writing. I have a lot of kind of anxiety and I guess shame connected to writing. Writing can be quite humiliating one way or another, but I think therapy just made me feel just more confident about expressing a novel in that form. It helps you not to care so much of what other people think. That's a good thing about it.
The narrator of Swing Time has no name. Why? So to
Really,
fool the reader
yeah.
into conflating it with you even more.
No, I guess when I was thinking about the story, it feels like somebody talking to themselves, and I just couldn't see why they would think or refer to themselves in this third person, or why they would name their mother or it's almost like a voice from the inside, not presenting itself to anybody. And I also quite like the idea of it being fable-like. But there is no particular reason apart from, for some reason, it felt right, stylistically right from the beginning. And I never wavered from it. I didn't even really realize that was the case until quite far into the book. But I liked it that way. I still do.
Actually, me too. I mean, as a reader, I didn't really notice until quite far.
Right. And that's quite funny, that idea. But the whole idea of personal identity of somebody's being presented, I was really trying to escape. I was trying to think, how do people speak about their lives when they're not being overheard? I wanted to just try and imagine a voice going through the events of their life and trying to understand what happened. What did I do? Why did I do it? Why did other people do what they did? And not this preoccupation with who am I?
Could you read a passage from near the beginning of the book? It's from
Sure.
Part 1, Early Days.
If all the Saturdays of 1982 can be thought of as one day, I met Tracy at 10 a.m. on that Saturday, walking through the sandy gravel of a churchyard, each holding our mother's hand. There were many other girls present, but for obvious reasons we noticed each other, the similarities and the differences, as girls will. Our shade of brown was exactly the same, as if one piece of tan material had been cut to make us both, and our freckles gathered in the same areas, we were of the same height. But my face was ponderous and melancholy, with a long, serious nose, and my eyes turned down, as did my mouth. Tracy's face was perky and round. She looked like a darker Shirley Temple, except her nose was as problematic as mine. I could see that much at once, a ridiculous nose. It went straight up in the air like a little piglet. Cute, but also obscene. Her nostrils were on permanent display. On noses, you could call it a draw. On hair, she won comprehensively. She had spiral curls. They reached to her backside and were gathered into two long plaits, glossy with some kind of oil, tied at their ends with satin yellow bows. Satin yellow bows were a phenomenon unknown to my mother. She pulled my great frizz back in a single cloud, tied with a black band. My mother was a feminist. She wore her hair in a half-inch afro, her skull was perfectly shaped, she never wore makeup, and dressed us both as plainly as possible. Hair is not essential when you look like Nefertiti. She'd no need of makeup or products or jewelry or expensive clothes, and in this way her financial circumstances, her politics and her aesthetic were all perfectly, conveniently matched. Accessories only cramped her style, including, or so I felt at the time, the horse-faced 7-year-old by her side. Looking across at Tracy, I diagnosed the opposite problem. Her mother was white, obese, afflicted with acne. She wore her thin blonde hair pulled back very tightly in what I knew my mother would call a Kilburn facelift. But Tracy's personal glamour was the solution. She was her own mother's most striking accessory. The family look, though not to my mother's taste, I found captivating. Logos, tin bangles and hoops, Diamante everything, expensive trainers of the kind my mother refused to recognize as a reality in the world. Those aren't shoes. Despite appearances, though, there was not much to choose between our two families. We were both from the estates, neither of us received benefits, a matter of pride for my mother, an outrage to Tracy's. She tried many times and failed to get on the disability. In my mother's view, it was exactly these superficial similarities that lent so much weight to questions of taste. She dressed for a future not yet with us, but which she expected to arrive.
Zadie Smith, reading from her novel Swing Time. As we just heard, the setting for the novel is one that you featured before in your fiction, the multicultural working-class neighborhood where you were raised in northwest London, in Kilburn. Right. Both girls are racially mixed, their skin color the same, but there are differences in their backgrounds and values. Can you talk a bit about the bond that develops between these two girls, what they find in each other?
I think they have a kind of instinct for comparison, as maybe girls of that age do, or women of all ages. They bond as two kids who feel a kind of tribal connection in a neighborhood which is still, mainly white, British. And I think it's about watching the other girl and finding out how to live. I think small girls read each other like we read novels, as a kind of guide. You wait for the other girl to do something, make a mistake, and then think, oh, not that. Or do something good and think, oh, yes, that. In a way that I think boys of the same age are much less inclined to do. One of the differences I notice in my children that, if my daughter's with another girl and we're parting for the day, the other girl will want to know, where are we going? What are we doing? Are we going to have ice cream when we get home? What time are you going to bed? Are you going to watch a movie? And whatever answers you give, the girl will be infuriated. Just at the idea of you continuing elsewhere, not with this person, doing other things. But I'm with my son, if we part from another boy, it's as if that boy just doesn't exist anymore. There's no interest in what he's going to go on to do that evening. I don't know why that should be true between boys and girls. I don't think it's, a fundamental law, but I have noticed it. This ability of girls to project themselves into another woman's life or another girl's life and wonder what's going to happen and judge themselves by this comparison. I don't think it's just a kind of curse, and that, in the popular culture it's described as just envy. You'd say that just the I character and Tracy have an envious or spiteful or love-hate relationship. I don't think it is that. I think it's this incredible act of imaginative empathy. Like you're kind of tortured by the idea that you can imagine what's going on in Tracy's house when she goes home, what she's getting that you're not getting or whatever. So that relationship kind of interests me because there's something almost fictional in it, a fictional instinct.
Yeah, you've explored female friendships before, but the relationship that develops between the two girls in Swing Time it's extremely close. It's based on shared interests and passions, but at the same time, there's an edge to it. The narrator might make admiring references to Tracy's sharpness, but there's also a streak of cruelty in her.
Right.
Why does she mostly excuse that?
I only realize these things sometimes when I finish the novels, but it's certainly got aspects of a survivor's tale, no? And I think the thing about meritocratic life in England at that time is that it was being offered to you the possibility of escape, right? That's how it was presented. Certainly the route I took was the one offered, which is an academic escape out of a certain kind of life. But the flip side of that is the implication that many other people do not get that opportunity, do not deserve to get it, have somehow failed. The stakes are so high, And I think in middle-class life in England at the time, the stakes were much lower. I see it with my own children who are solidly middle class, if not upper middle class, that it's not a matter of life or death to them. And children intuit that very, very early on. They know that if they don't get the best grades or whatever, it's not the end of the world. But these children understood that it's everything. It's a difference between one life and another. And that causes all kinds of, I think, deformations in people's personalities and in their relationships to each other. Because there is that question of, if I win, do you have to lose?
So there's real rivalry rather than just a different
survivalism. Yeah, it's about who gets to survive. And of course, the community shouldn't feel that way. The kind of room for failure and error that, say, an upper middle class white child has in England, which enables them to live in this generally quite jolly and peaceful way, is not extended to many other children in England who feel that they are in a battle for survival.
The narrator's mother in the novel is very strong, inspirational, but not for the narrator.
Right.
In fact, they're almost estranged. Is this just the normal generational tension or a rejection of parental expectations, or is there more to it than that?
I was just curious about it. My own mother was not that kind of person. She was not an activist. But when I got to college, I met people who were the children of these kind of people, like very admirable people who'd done great work in the public sphere. And I guess I noticed, just as I noticed about the children of academics, which I wrote a little about on Beauty, that there's a kind of tension between your intimate life and this public life, right? That these parents who I would have admired in the abstract, and then I meet their children and find this kind of suffering. That I was very curious about that. Because it speaks to bigger questions about where your intimate life begins and ends and where your communal or public life begins. What should be sacrificed? What's important? So the mother in this book, I admire her, but I was just interested in the way that when you're forced into endless political commitment, what that does to your intimate life.
Well, usually it's the sacrifice of the intimate life.
It is, but is it worth it? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I don't write these novels with solutions in mind. I really am curious. I think it's a very interesting choice that people make when they go down that road. And there's a lot of examples in the literary world from people like Alice Walker, though I know that they seem to be closer now, Alice Walker and her daughter. But all the literary women of a generation before me, people like Muriel Spark, Doris Lessing, even Edna O'Brien, I was always aware of this tension, between the woman's, I don't mean public as in famous, but a woman's work in the world and her work at home, right? It's not a simple equation. Though, as much as we'd like to say, oh, whatever, you can have it all, do what you want, it's not like that. So I was interested in writing about that, and also, getting some comedy out of it, because the political commitments of the mother are so extreme and relentless that there is a little bit of, not for the narrator herself, but maybe for the reader, there's some amusement in it. Yeah.
You dedicated Swing Time to your mother. What does she think of the mother in the novel?
She thought it was more like me than her, which I think is a very fair point. And is right, but particularly the academic concerns are really mine, not hers. I think my mother is very, she was a little annoyed because I had friends who thought she died when they read this book. That's how convincing the eye is when you write it. It's such a convincing literary trick. But I think she's very used to all these phony literary avatars in my novels, and she doesn't mind it too much. She's quite proud generally these days. She takes it as a feather in her cap. And then she's got my brother who's a stand-up doing all this comedy about his family as well. So and my little brother rapping about it. So I think she's got a lot on. She's used to it. I think she's slightly bemused that we all have so much to say about one not particularly interesting family. Yeah.
I only well, there are a couple of things, but one I particularly recognized of you and your mother was the way she reads. She figures out how much time she has and how many pages she can get through, and as an obsessive reader.
Yeah, that's definitely my habit. You see, it's my habit, and so I was also thinking about, it's a kind of extrapolation, like what is the worst case kind of parent I could be? and what would it result in, and how would my child react? It's a kind of horrible projection into the future, a hypothetical.
Zadie Smith in New York. She's my guest today on Writers and Company on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM Radio, and around the world on cbc.ca. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Zadie Smith, self-actualization, discovering happiness, becoming the person you're meant to be, has been a theme in popular culture for some time now. And you explore this phenomenon in an essay called Find Your Beach. What does that slogan mean?
Well, that's what I was trying to work out, because it was outside my window for like 3.5 months. So it was a serious question to myself. What does that mean? Because it appeared to be self-evident, or otherwise I wouldn't have put it in, huge advert in the middle of New York. So I was trying to interpret it. I guess I interpreted it as an idea that you can find your pleasure in an almost isolated way, that you have to pursue it as a goal. Like the pursuit of happiness as a literal, concrete thing that you can then attain, and as the kids say on the internet, win at life. That seems to be a very common idea at the moment, that it's possible for people to win at life. It's not something that I believe to be true. I can't imagine what winning at life would look like. Though I do remember as a young person, when you look forward, you see people in a certain life position, and you do have that error. You think, oh, that they've come to the end and they've succeeded at life. They've won it as if it were a game. As you get older, of course, it becomes very, very obvious that there's no winning. It's not that kind of a setup. And there is no position or identity you could achieve that would bring you some kind of absolute happiness. What's most extraordinary, I guess, is the people like our Mr. Trump, who really believe it and die believing it. Who never remove themselves from that idea that they have won. Underneath it, of course, there must be such a huge well of fear and terror, because there's no avoiding death, and they know that too. But it's a kind of illusion you can sit in. So, that's what I guess when I'm writing, I'm trying to move away from the idea that there is some kind of identity that you could have that would feel like a final point and a success, and more of the idea of life as an ongoing process that in the end, ends.
Although the idea of self-actualization, as you say, is very American, and it doesn't fit as well when you're back home in Britain. What happens there?
Well, I don't know if that's so true anymore. No, that one thing America's been very good at is a cultural exploitation of its ideas, and they're everywhere. In England, just as much. And I think sometimes English people flatter themselves that they are somewhere behind this kind of celebrity-obsessed, identity-obsessed culture. But as far as I can see, it looks more like the other way around, no? Quite a lot of the time these days we're exporting these TV shows and concepts to America. I guess I always thinking that I would like to be, myself included, more concerned with my duties, my obligations, my relation to other people than my identity or persona. I think it might be something of a dead end. Not that it isn't important politically and personally to be recognized by others as who you are. I don't deny it. It's horrible to be misrecognized or misidentified. But once that's done, it's the beginning of a much harder journey.
I was interested in this idea of self-actualization. I mean, the sense that anything is possible in relation to the character of Amy in your novel,
Right.
Swing Time. I mean, she's a superstar performer, a little bit like Madonna, just a bit,
Right.
but someone who's risen from humble roots in Australia to become an international celebrity. What interests you in this kind of personality?
When you write a load of books, you only find out as you finish them what they're about. And I feel, I might be wrong, but I feel when I look back at what I've written that it's always about a recognition of limits in all areas. The limit of political perfectibility, of human perfectibility, limits. And I put Amy in the book partly out of admiration for someone who sees no limits. It's always extraordinary to meet people like that, with that kind of will and monomania. And I do genuinely admire it, because people like that do create change, whereas people like me don't, for the most part. Our ambivalence is too high. So it's not that I dismiss that kind of energy. I admire it, particularly in women, particularly. But I also do believe in limits, limit of a human life and what's possible in it. And not in a sense of failure or fatalism, but humility and propriety to understand where your power ends and what can be done and what can't be done, and making peace with what can't be done. So that's why she's there. It interests me, the idea of limitlessness, and I wanted an example of it. I think all the characters make the same errors, it's just that Amy has more space in which to make them.
Because she is almost limitless. I mean, I think maybe she
almost is.
She gets foiled in love here and there, but otherwise...
She does. And there's age. You can't avoid age. Like, it's just looking at a generation of people, my generation really, who felt that we were beyond all limits, biological, physical, socio-historical, and that I think we are being proven wrong in a quite brutal way in our intimate lives and in our political lives. So, yeah, it's a correction.
Necessarily proven wrong? I mean, unavoidably,
yes.
Inevitably?
Yes. It's dangerous for a finite being to think of itself as infinite. It's not safe for anybody. So it's the correction is important.
Is it an accident that the narrator should end up working as a personal assistant to someone as confident and driven as Amy?
It's a kind of, I guess, a reflection of my own feeling recently of being surrounded by people who feel such a confidence in their identities, or at least are able to package and express them so firmly. And also, I was just interested all the way through the novel of the idea of people feeding off other people working for other people, countries feeding off other countries, power feeding off weakness. And I just tried to trace as many examples of it as I could, try and understand how it works. Because part of the problem is that I feel for a lot of people feel as if they are on the left, is that they are complicit in situations that they'd rather not be. They know every time they go to the supermarket, every time they order coffee, every time they buy clothes, every time they travel, that they are involved in a system of deep inequality. And it's a horrible realization. It doesn't mean that all these people are evil. It's not evil to go and buy clothes that were made by children, but it's also not great, and it's what we're doing in a daily manner. So I was interested in those systems of power that we've inserted ourselves into. And sometimes we deal with it unthinkingly. I wanted to recreate, somebody asked me recently why the West African country isn't named. And it was really because I wanted to create in the novel a repetition of the way we think about these situations in the real world. And I noticed giving the book to people, if they emailed me to talk about it, they would often mention the country with great confidence, and it's not the country that is clearly expressed in the novel. Its capital city is named, its various villages. And it's interesting to me. Imagine coming from and living in your life out in a country which is so unfamous, to use the most vulgar term, that people don't even recognize it and don't even care to Google to check when discussing and thinking of it. I think it's hard for Americans to imagine that consciousness, to live in that world where you are a footnote, dismissible both in prose and in life and in action.
But why don't you name it? I mean,
because I wanted the reader to realize what they were doing. It's the same process when you read. Like when you're giving a book to a reader nowadays, you're giving it to basically a cyborg, right? Somebody who is a reader, but also has the whole of the internet at their fingers at all moments. So it's kind of interesting what you choose to understand and what you don't understand, and why not. I wanted to recreate in the novel the same kind of power relations that are happening in the world.
Because it's the Gambia.
It is the Gambia, but it's amazing how many people who read it have no interest in finding out where it is. Like, it's really mind-boggling. So that was kind of curious to me.
Zadie Smith, we talked earlier about the 1930s and 40s Hollywood films that you loved as a child, and taken at face value, the golden age Hollywood musicals, so beloved by the characters in your novel, represent a more innocent or optimistic time. But there are other stories there, another way of looking at them. When did you become aware of that?
I always remember thinking of musicals as hugely problematic. That's somehow what I liked about them. It's the same. I have the same instinct in my social life. Like, my husband will always say that if we're at a party, I gravitate towards the most awful person out of a certain kind of pleasure at talking to people who are demonstrably awful. I don't know why, but musicals are like that for me. Like they're a mixture of the sublime and the obviously awful. Terrible plots, offensive routines. I don't know why I'm attracted to that kind of mixed form. It's obviously much cooler and more sensible to be attracted to perfect form. But something about perfect form repels me. I don't know why. My novels too are like that. I know they should be slim and controlled, and instead they're this rag bag. It's something in me. I don't know why. I want the high and low and the mixture of forms. But I remember from a very young age always being aware of them as productions. So I would watch something, even a non-musical, like I'd watch Gone with the Wind is a perfect example. A hugely problematic film, enjoy it enormously, and also be aware at all times that it was a film, but my mind would be on the backstage activities. Like I was thinking about Hattie MacDonald or Butterfly McQueen and what it was like to be on set and who talked to them and who didn't. And that was always my concern, like what was going on behind. And I don't know why that's the case, but it was. And also those musicals, on British TV at that time, you'd have to play Spot the Black Person, which my family always did, trying to find anybody on TV who was a little bit like us. Whereas in these musicals, for better or worse, there were a lot of people like us in demeaning roles, saying ridiculous things with the fake speech that they had to recreate in their mouths, even if they never spoke like that. But still, they were recognizable. So I think I was drawn partly for that reason, too.
But in your novel, the narrator's mother tries to give her a sense of the cultural or political context for these Hollywood films. And one of the often cited examples of Hollywood racism is Fred Astaire in blackface as Bojangles of Harlem in the 1936 film Swing Time. What do you make of it?
I really don't see it that way. Partly because I know the history between Fred and Bojangles, and partly because of the dance itself, which is a long way from, something like Holiday Inn, which I just rewatched, which has a minstrel scene in the middle, Bing Crosby, everybody else in blackface, to this extraordinarily awful song by Irving Berlin about Lincoln's birthday, the day the darkies were freed, as the lyric goes. And that minstrel act is so abusive. I mean, it'll bring you to tears. There's a Topsy, that classic Topsy character of such hideous idiocy. Everything about it, the way it's danced, the way the people sing, it's meant to wound. But Astaire as Bojangles is a completely different affair. He never makes the minstrel face, the rolling eyes. His makeup is minimal. His impersonation is perfect. I've always read it as an act of homage to a dancer he admired very much, which doesn't mean that Astaire wasn't a racist, because he could be incredibly difficult to black people he worked with on set, like most white actors at that time. But going across or beyond or around that situation was this huge admiration for a particular dancer. So to me, it's a very interesting performance because I get a lot of mixed feelings from it, but the one overpowering all others is love and admiration in an act of imitation and absolute cultural appropriation, which it is. But he was obsessed with Bojangles. He thought he was a great, great dancer. And it's an attempt to become him for 2.5 minutes.
Which is similar to what you were saying earlier in terms of his appreciation of Michael Jackson.
Right.
The narrator discovers a wonderful African-American dancer, Jenny Lagon, in a film called Ali Baba Goes to Town from 1937, starring Eddie Cantor. And Jenny Lagon was one of the first black women to establish a solo career in tap. And she was in the movies, and then she moved to Canada, to Vancouver. What was her story?
Right. Well, I found her in that movie Ali Baba, and it was a perfect case of this luminosity of dance, right? Because the film itself is profoundly absurd and aggravating, and she comes on danced in a kind of tribal outfit and all the rest of it. But none of it can take away from the dance itself, which is extraordinary. And I was always aware that dancers like Jenny Lagon, black actors, were in this double bind where they were asked to demean themselves in these roles, and at the same time they were great artists. They had to try and demonstrate that art through this veil that was placed around them. And so that's what I see there, as a girl dancing so beautifully in such an impossible situation. But I was impressed when I started to read about her and watch this film at her kind of determination, her radicalism to move to Canada to get out of it, basically, and to start a life on her own terms. She taught dance for years and years to generations of students. And I just admired her grit and her talent. So it was a wonderful discovery. I wish she was one of those artists I wish I had known about when I was a kid. It would have been a great boon to me.
I took a couple of lessons from her, and I wish I'd taken more.
Right. She's an inspiring dancer and of such technical skill and just joy. Like, it's impossible to watch her without feeling this joy. And yet, watching this film, I understood that she was a radical person in her thought. And she was infuriated by the situation in America, deeply saddened by it, horrified by it. And to still retain that joy in the face of all that, I think is something really amazing. You know, I feel so defeated by the smallest political depression in this country, and she had to live through something which I would consider almost unlivable. And to come out of it not deformed, I think is the miracle of somebody like that.
Now, in your novel, you have Jenny Lagon physically resemble the narrator's childhood friend Tracy. How does she figure in the book?
She is in this kind of act of comparison between the two girls. They then find somebody outside of their duo to compare themselves to. I think that's a very common habit of female relationships too. And Tracy takes her as an absolute model. You know, when you're a young black girl, you're always being told about role models, the necessity of them. And when I was a kid, I always found it both a freeing idea and a restrictive one, because of course the role models are always chosen from a kind of narrow pool. They're chosen because literally they look like you. And that can be helpful and not helpful. They could look like you and be in an area of life that you have no interest in being. Like, I didn't want to be an athlete, for example. I didn't want to be a dancer. I didn't want to be a singer. So part of the problem with role models is that it is based on this superficial similarity. And you know that exactly the freedom that you want every child to have is to take their models, if that's what they are, from anywhere, from any place at any time. As a kid, I had to be free to think whether I was right or not, that Shakespeare was part of my heritage, that Dickens was part of my heritage. I had to do that. I was in England trying to learn about the British novel. I had to claim these things as my own. But at the same time, if I hadn't known about people like Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, I don't think I could have survived it. So it's both a thing that frees you and in a certain way traps you. What you want is an ideal situation in which you feel liberated to make your common company with whoever you want. At the same time, it's very hard to get out the gate unless you feel that you have a sister somewhere.
You were saying if you'd known about Jenny Lagon when you were a child, it would have made a difference. Is that part of what you wanted to give to Tracy and the narrator by having
yes, and also to readers? Like I never would have thought about this when I was young, but now I feel explicitly that I am writing for the kid that I was, or for kids like me. I know it because I was just keep on going on to everyone about this recently, but I was reading this book, Homegoing, by Yaa Gyasi, who's a very young woman who's written a book about the history of the diaspora from slavery in Ghana through America and the Caribbean to present-day America. And I read it only recently, and I felt so liberated and freed by it. And my second thought was, what if I'd had this book at 15? And that's the gift of that kind of writing, that Yara has written a book that 15-year-olds will read, and they will come into the world differently than I did, or my mother did. It's such a gift of freedom. So I find that an extraordinary part of writing. I don't think I write in as emphatic a way as Yaa Gyasi. I guess whatever gift I give is a little more oblique, but I appreciate it in other writers very much.
But you do have your narrator spend quite a lot of time in West Africa, in the Gambia. You went there yourself. What took you there?
Well, I've been going not just to the Gambia, but to West Africa for a while. First for work. I went to Liberia a few times to write about it. Then for intimate reasons, my mother was married for a while to a Ghanaian. So she went to Ghana and had a whole Ghanaian life for a number of years. And my uncle is also married to a girl he met in Ghana. So there were kind of family reasons, which I think are not uncommon between Jamaican families and West African families, intermarriage and a kind of sympathy between the communities. And then out of just further curiosity, I guess, and knowing that I wanted to write this book, I started going more regularly. And it's been a great thing for me. I saw my mother doing it. My mother's reasons, I think in the first place, were explicitly, I don't want to say sentimental because it sounds to debate it, but she was in search of her roots. And I think she found it a fulfilling experience, and I have found it to be so also.
Can you say how? I mean, did you feel a sense of connection, or?
Yes, I did. I mean, the similarities between West African life and Jamaican life are obvious and very strong in terms of just the way people live, their relationships with their children, their relationships across their family, clans, the idea of a compound. It's all familiar from Jamaican life. And I mean, this is all kind of common wisdom, but it is very hard to live and to live well and to live in an undamaged way without having a history. And as you get older, this becomes more and more obvious to you. These things which you're told as a child, which you perhaps only half believe. It's important. It's important for Germans to know Germany. It's important for the French to know France. It's the opposite of being stranded. And for diaspora people, it's a more complicated journey back, and certainly a painful one. But it's important. It's important to know that Africa has a complex, varied history, cultural, historical, political. And I guess I've been shocked in middle age to realize just how little Black British people were taught in schools about where they came from. I mean, it's only in middle age that I've become so furious and amazed at it that I could spend 2 years studying the Chartists, for example, and never be told a single word about the British slavery in Jamaica, when half the class were the direct historical product of that experience. It's just extraordinary.
Remind me what the Chartists is.
Oh, the Chartists are like, oh God, can I even remember? 19th century political activists who were trying to... Anyway, it's so boring I can't even... this is what we were studying. And most of the kids switched off, understandably. It's not that British history isn't important, but what an extraordinary lacuna. Like, you've got these kids in your class, you've got an incredible opportunity to engage them and unite the history of their family and the history of the country they find themselves in. And silence. It's not an exaggeration to say, and I hope kids of my generation would admit it, because I know it was my experience and many others, that a lot of Jamaican kids did not know that they were not native to their island. They did not know that. They had never heard of the Arawak Indians. They didn't know that they had been brought as slaves to Jamaica. They understood that American slavery existed, but that was what a blank our knowledge was of our own history. And that is obscene, I think.
And if anything, it was even more brutal in Jamaica.
The British history of slavery in the Caribbean is as brutal as it is possible to be. The more I study it, it's just absolutely extraordinary.
While in Africa, the narrator tours a slavery museum on an island off the coast, and it's very disturbing to her, but not in the way that she expects. Was this a place that you visited as well?
I did visit it, and I had lots of friends who'd gone to the Cape Coast Castle, which is where people normally go when they're on these trips in Ghana. And I was trying to think. I mean, I've toured many. I've also been to Auschwitz, and I've toured Liberia, where the church people were burnt alive, massacred. So I think everybody's had these experiences of site of historical trauma. I was trying to draw on all of them. Like, what does it mean to visit these places? What are you meant to feel? How are you meant to react? I tried to write about that. Again, to me, it's not a point of closure or a final destination. I feel in these places that you're being taught a present lesson about a continuing trauma. So, I didn't find it particularly cathartic, and I guess that I gave that to the character.
Mm-hmm. She says every scene had a cartoon thinness to it, that she...
Right.
Felt no closer to reality than this mural on the side of the museum.
Just because, as I said in the book, the trauma is unending in the case of the diaspora. It's not that such places shouldn't be marked, but the idea that they represent a kind of closure, I don't feel.
Zadie Smith, there's often sadness in your work, as in life, but there's also joy. Are they opposites?
Not for me. I'd recognize a kind of melancholy strain in my personality. I think most writers have it, though. I don't think it's unusual. But I also feel personally like quite a large capacity for joy, for fun. I love to have fun. I love to laugh. And I try and... like a Poe-faced novel for me is not a novel at all. A novel that doesn't find fun and beauty in life, which I really find in a kind of daily way, almost too much so. And so I guess when I'm writing, I'm always trying to think about that too. Like, what right do you have to be laughing today? That's a very modern feeling, right? Like, you laugh, you have joy, you wear a nice dress, get drunk, see your friends, and wonder all the times, what conditions allow me to do this, and how long can it go on for, and is it even real? Like, I think one of the great tensions of a globalized life is that one's life feels unreal to oneself, given the condition that people live in all over the world. You can say with the Christian theme, well, the poor have always been with us, of course is true, but it's never before in our lifetimes have we been so aware at all times of how so many different people live in so many different circumstances, like these weird gateways into other worlds. So I don't know, I write from that perspective as a person who lives a lot of the time with a certain amount of joy and is also aware that it perhaps can't last.
In an essay on joy, you've described it as a difficult emotion to manage and one that's often misunderstood. In what way?
Well, I guess I said there that it gets mistaken for pleasure a lot. I find joy to be a sublime emotion. I think the sublime is always tinged with terror of loss. I think I use children as an example there. It's the most obvious example, but I guess one that a lot of people can understand and relate to, that children bring you such an intensity of joy, but it must be in some way connected to the idea of the terror of what would happen if you lost them. The stakes are so extraordinarily high. And that is an emotion that I am very attached to, but it's also in some ways easier, and a lot of people choose this way, to live at a less high pitch, to make the possibility of pleasure and sadness smaller. When I'm living online, when I'm in a laptop or just concentrating on online life, I feel that, that I've managed to control the range of emotions, and I can see how tempting that can be. You have these incredible people in Japan, I can't remember the name for them, the shut-ins, who really decide the only safe way to kind of exist in the world is just to be online in your room and not deal with the vagaries of people who can create such misery and joy in you. I totally sympathize with that position, and I have a strong instinct in myself to shut down and just try and to manage things and moderate things. But life being what it is, it's hard to do. I've got children now, so I'm kind of in it, whether I want it or not.
I was just interested in the distinction between pleasure and joy. That pleasure is somehow it's easier to manage. That pleasure you can have every day.
You can. A little pleasure is easy, yeah, and can be bought, and all those things can be purchased. And I don't think they last very long. They're kind of like soap bubbles, and you just want more and more of it, and it can lead to a kind of melancholy in itself. But joy seems to be something that you can't demand or get when you want it. It just kind of comes across you. It comes over you. And maybe it's the fact that you can't control it, which is so unnerving. Yeah.
We started this conversation talking about song and dance, and I was wondering about your kids. What kinds of music and dance do you expose them to?
Well, the one thing which is so different now with iTunes and stuff is that kids grow up with such an ahistorical, they don't have any idea what music is. Like when we had those record collections of our parents, you had a historical sense, partly because of the way things looked, right? Each cover looked, you could tell the decade it was in. There was a certain progression. Often they were organized that way. And it does strike me that kids now, they have no historical context for what you're playing them. Like sometimes we'll just randomly play a song and then have to explain, oh, well, that was the Beatles. They were there. But it has no relation to anything else. It's so, to her or to my oldest child, John Lennon lives on the same plane as Taylor Swift. It's alphabetically arranged on this screen. So I don't know. It's odd. I don't see either of my children being particularly engaged because what we play them is so random. It's just someone walking over to the stereo, pressing a button, and so 1 minute it's Biggie, and 1 minute it's Bach, and 1 minute it's this. There's no continuity. The way our parents played music, you had to sit and listen to an album, you know? Got to know it really well, the progression of it, the story of it, how it related to another album. So I'm very curious to see how this generation will grow up with everything on the same plane, literally, historically, and literally. They don't see any difference. As far as I can tell so far, it makes it much less obsessive. They have no allegiance to a certain story of music, whereas I was very engaged with this idea of, well, there was Robert Johnson, and then there was this, then was that, and this is the line of black music, and this is the line of white music. That's how I understood it historically.
Do you sing to them?
Well, I sing all the time, as I did in my childhood house, but in both cases, nobody is interested in hearing me sing. Neither my brothers, nor my children, nor my husband, nor my mother, nor my father. My family are completely uninterested in me singing at all times. And quite often my children will say, please stop. Please stop doing that. Yeah.
Do you teach them to dance?
They don't want to learn anything from me, really. They're not interested in anything that I have to teach them. I read to them, and that's one place where I am considered to have some gifts, because I do all the voices and stuff. I'm appreciated in that area.
I'm glad to hear it. And it's great to have the chance to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Zadie Smith in New York. Swing Time is published by Penguin Random House. Writers and Company is produced by Sandra Rabinovich. Katie Swales is associate producer. Technical operations by Sweeney. We always like to hear from you. Our email address is writersandco@cbc.ca. The telephone number is 416-205-6631. For news and reviews all about books, check out cbcbooks.ca. The executive producer is Tara Mora. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Next week from the United States, Congolese-French writer Alain Mabankou. His latest books are charming explorations of childhood, family, and country. That's next week. I hope you'll join me.